One of the new realities that we're discovering is that as we experience climate change, we begin to experience issues with the weather. Superstorm Sandy certainly a very clear demonstration of that. The jury's still out on whether climate change had anything to do with the super tornadoes in Oklahoma, but we are living in a time when resilience begins to be a much more important issue as we think about city design, city construction, and city maintenance. New York City has not been immune to that experience, and under the leadership of Mayor Bloomberg, the city has taken on the challenge of trying to figure out how do we make New York City more resilient. Speaking to us today is the individual that the mayor asked to lead the effort, the president of the New York City Economic Development Corporation. Please welcome Seth Pinsky.
Thank you very much. I wanted to talk to you this afternoon, about the Special Initiative for Rebuilding and Resiliency, which is the effort that Mayor Bloomberg put together following Hurricane Sandy, where he asked us to take a step back and to answer three very important questions for him. The three questions that he asked us to answer were, one, what happened during Hurricane Sandy? And many of us lived through it. It wasn't that long ago. So on some levels, it seems like it's probably an easy question to answer. But in fact, he wanted us to look at it not at an anecdotal level, but on an analytical level. Second, he wanted to ask us to look forward and ask what could happen in the future given the impacts of climate change. And third, he asked us the really important question I think most people care the most about, and that is, so what do we do given the future that we're facing? And what I wanted to do was walk you through what our findings were at a very high level with respect to each of these questions, starting with what happened during Hurricane Sandy and why. And I think the most important chart when evaluating what happened during Hurricane Sandy is this one. This shows the top 10 high water marks at the Battery in Lower Manhattan since 1900. And what you'll notice about this chart is two things. One is you'll notice that all 10 of the top 10 high water marks occurred since 1950, which I think is very important. But second, you'll also notice that Hurricane Sandy exceeded the previous high water mark by some 40%. And that was really the distinguishing characteristic of this storm. It wasn't the wind, which relatively speaking was low. It wasn't the rain, which in even absolute terms was low. It was the storm surge. And the ingredients that came together in order to create this surge were several. First of all, there was the size of the storm. If you look on the left, that is an image of Hurricane Katrina as it was approaching the Gulf Coast. On the right, Hurricane Sandy as it was approaching the east coast of the United States. As you can see, Hurricane Sandy was over 3 times as large as Hurricane Katrina. Second, there was an unusual track. Normally, when storms come up the East Coast, they head to the north and then northeast and out to sea. In this case, Hurricane Sandy took a very uncharacteristic leftward hook when it approached New Jersey, but for the fact that it was recharacterized at the last minute as a post-tropical cyclone, it would have been only the 3rd hurricane to hit the New Jersey coast since 1878. Now, another important factor in the story of Hurricane Sandy is the precise timing of the storm's arrival. And you can see that from this chart. Again, we're back at the Battery. This is a chart over time showing the water levels at the Battery. The blue line that you see that goes up and down is the normal tidal cycle. The green line is the surge that came in with Sandy without taking into account the tide. And the red line is the sum of the blue and the green lines, what actually happened. And what you can see is that the surge peaked at almost the exact moment of high tide. And as a result of that, you had over 14 feet of water coming in at the Battery at the peak of the surge. Now, that timing was very critical. And to illustrate that, what I want to show you is a comparison of what actually happened, which is on this chart. This is northern Queens and the South Bronx. And the only thing you need to know to understand this is that our area here in New York actually has different tidal cycles. Long Island Sound is on a different cycle than the ocean and the harbor. So when the storm struck, it was high tide at the Battery, but it was actually low tide up here in Long Island Sound. And what you can see is that there was a fair amount of flooding at LaGuardia Airport, which is the area in the middle. There was some in areas of northern Queens, but generally not a whole lot of flooding. If instead this storm had come 9.5 hours earlier, this is what would have happened in northern Queens. And what you can see is not just an extensive amount of flooding in areas like College Point. What you can also see is the fact that LaGuardia Airport would have been under, in some places, more than 12 feet of water. Hunts Point in the north, which is the source of much of the fresh food that is distributed in New York City, would have been significantly inundated. And the area in northern Queens on the left, which is northern Astoria, where a third of the in-city generation, power generation in New York would also have been extensively flooded. So timing made a big difference. And one other way that timing made a big difference can be seen on this chart. What you see on the left is that at 8 o'clock when the surge first started coming in, the winds were coming out of the northeast and heading towards the southwest. But at 10, as the surge was peaking, the winds actually shifted. And instead, they were coming from the southeast and heading towards the northwest. And that did two things. One, what it did was it pushed the water literally into the southern portions of the city, Staten Island, Coney Island, the Rockaways, but also it whipped up the waves. And the result of all of this are the results that we're all very familiar with, which you can see on this chart. The little yellow and red dots are the buildings that were tagged as damaged by the city's Department of Buildings. And you can see that there was less structural damage, fewer red tags in the northern areas in the harbor, where it was primarily still water inundation, but along the coastlines where you had not only still water inundation, but also significant wave action, there was a significant amount of structural damage that occurred to buildings. So summarizing all of this, what we learned from our analysis of Hurricane Sandy is that the chances of Hurricane Sandy's repeating itself exactly the same way sometime in the future, though not impossible, the chances are relatively slim. But what we should take from Hurricane Sandy is, one, the fact that many lives were in fact significantly impacted by the storm, and we owe, as a moral duty, we owe it to the people whose lives were impacted to help them to rebuild. But second, we also have to think about Hurricane Sandy as a harbinger of a type of threat that we as a city face. And that, I think, provides a nice segue to the second question that the mayor asked us to answer, and that is what could happen in the future. And the place that we start when we evaluate the city's vulnerability to storms is by looking at the FEMA flood maps from 1983. And though they're 30 years old, these were the flood maps that were actually in effect when Hurricane Sandy hit the New York area. And as you can see, they cover an extensive area. The 100-year floodplain covers an extensive area of the city. And in fact, today, over 200,000 residents, over 200,000 jobs, nearly 36,000 buildings, and over 350 million square feet of built area are all contained within the city's 100-year floodplain. But what we found during Hurricane Sandy was that, in fact, those maps understated our vulnerability. What this chart shows in blue is the 100-year floodplain that was in effect on those FEMA flood maps. In red, what it shows you is the areas that actually flooded outside of that 100-year floodplain. And what the words on the right side of the page indicate is that over a third of the red and yellow tag buildings, the buildings designated as damaged by the Department of Buildings, were outside of that 100-year floodplain. Nearly half of all impacted residential units were outside of that 100-year floodplain, and over half of all impacted buildings were outside of that 100-year floodplain. Now, the good news is that the city of New York has realized for some time that these maps are out of date. And so a couple of years ago, we encouraged FEMA to begin work on updating the maps. And in fact, they had started to do so. And when Hurricane Sandy hit, although they weren't yet finished with their work, they decided to release interim flood maps to give an indication of where they were heading in their evaluations of the risk. And these maps here are the interim flood maps that were released just about a week ago by FEMA. And what you can see is that they've significantly expanded the floodplain in New York City. In fact, whereas before there were a little over 200,000 residents who were in the 100-year floodplain, today it's almost 400,000. The number of buildings has nearly doubled from 36,000 to almost 70,000. And a stunning number, the number of square feet has gone from a little south of 400 million to over 530 million square feet in the city of New York. So all of this shows that, in fact, the vulnerability is greater than we thought. But in a bit of bad news, I would say, it actually doesn't tell the full story. And the reason for that is that, first of all, these maps are backwards looking. They predict the future based on historical performance in the area. But they also leave out large portions of the story of climate change. They don't talk, for example, about future risks of downpours. They don't talk about future risks of heat waves, which incidentally kill more people each year than any other natural phenomenon in the United States. They don't talk about the future risks of drought, and they certainly don't talk about the future risks of sea level rise. Now, Mayor Bloomberg was aware of this as far back as 2007 when we released the landmark Plan YC long-term sustainability plan. And at that time, Mayor Bloomberg put together a group of academics from leading institutions, you see them listed here, who would help us to predict what the future would look like for New York across a whole range of factors given climate change. And what the Panel on Climate Change did in 2009 was they developed a very detailed study that in fact contained all of those predictions. As part of this effort in 2013, post-Sandy, we asked the Panel on Climate Change to come back together and update their findings. And here on the page is a chart that describes those updated findings. They look at the 2020s, the midterm, and the 2050s, and they say, what is New York going to look like across a whole host of factors ranging from not just sea level rise and storm surge, but also things like heat waves and temperature. And let me just highlight two things on here. One is that in the out years, the Panel on Climate Change is now projecting that with a fairly high degree of confidence, they believe that sea levels will rise between 1 and 2 feet, and on the upside or bad case scenario, it could be higher than 2.5 feet. And keep in mind that this is on top of a foot of sea level rise that has already occurred in the New York area since 1900. The second line that I would bring your attention to is the following. Today, on average, there are 18 days each year during which in New York it is above 90 degrees. The projection in the out years is that that number could more than double. And in fact, in the downside scenario, there could be as many 90-degree days on average here in New York City as there currently are in Birmingham, Alabama, a significant change in the climate of the area. Now, based on the information that we received from the Panel on Climate Change, we've developed a series of what we call future flood maps. And that is layering on top of the existing flood maps the likely impact of sea level rise as projected by the panel. And what you can see here in blue are the existing 100-year floodplains. In yellow, the floodplains as they will change by the 2020s, and in red, the floodplains as they will change by the 2050s. And again, with the chart on the right, you can see that whereas today there are about 400,000 people living in our 100-year floodplain, by 2050 there could be over 800,000 people, over 10% of our city's population. Buildings could go from nearly 70,000 to almost 115,000, and floor area could go from over 500 million to well north of 850 million square feet. What we also have found in our analysis is that, in fact, sea level rise poses a risk to New York, even excluding the impacts of coastal storms. In fact, our modeling indicates that by the 2050s, nearly 10% of the city's coastline could experience regular coastal flooding just during normal high tides, even without any storm affecting the area. And that percentage could be significantly higher in areas like Brooklyn, where it's 10%, and in Queens, where it's nearly 14%. Another important question to ask is, well, so what is the economic impact of all of this? And what you can see here based on work that we've done with Swiss Re, the reinsurance company, is that today a 1 in 70-year storm is a $19 billion event. That's roughly the scale of what happened during Hurricane Sandy. By the 2020s, a $19 billion event will be occurring roughly once every 60 years. And by the 2050s, we're talking about once every 50 years. Now, that may not sound like a big change, but that means that in any given year, there is a 40% higher likelihood of a storm like Hurricane Sandy occurring here in the New York area. Another way of thinking about this is that, again, today, that 1 in 70-year storm is a $19 billion event. By the 2020s, that same magnitude storm could end up costing the city $35 billion. And by the 2050s, we could be talking about nearly $90 billion. So what does all of this mean? What this means is that we have always known that we in a city like New York, as a coastal city, are vulnerable to coastal storms. And what Sandy and the FEMA maps show us is that, in fact, that vulnerability is greater than we had suspected. And what we learned from the panel on climate change and their projections is both that that vulnerability is going to increase as time goes forward, and, as importantly, that we're vulnerable to more than just coastal storms. And finally, what we learned from the analysis that I just shared with you from Swiss Re is that there is a real cost to inaction. And the result of all of this is that we believe very strongly that we as a city need to start acting, and we need to start acting now. And so what I want to finish with is a quick explanation of how we plan to address climate change. And underlying everything that we're doing are 4 core principles. One is that we believe that we have to be ambitious, but we also believe that what we do has to be achievable. It doesn't make sense to aim for the stars and then never get off the launching pad. 2, we believe that we have to acknowledge the fact that we live in a resource-limited world, but we have to try to stretch the resources that we do have as far as possible. And that means that we need to look at the costs and the benefits of everything that we propose to do, and we need to evaluate different strategies against one another based on those costs and benefits. And I will pause here just to remark that when we look at costs and benefits, it's not just dollars and cents. It's also looking at where vulnerable populations live, where there's important infrastructure, and other critical questions. Third, we believe that there is no silver bullet, that the answer is through a series of defenses, multi-layered defenses. We start with our coastline, but we also look at the buildings behind the coastline, and then we look at all of the systems and infrastructure that serves those buildings. And finally, with respect to the neighborhoods that were actually impacted by Sandy, we believe that we cannot abandon them, that we have to fight to preserve our coastal neighborhoods, and that we not only should be rebuilding, but where possible, we should also be improving. Now, in our report, we have developed a 20-chapter series of responses to climate change across the full range of citywide systems and infrastructure that you see on the left, and focusing in particular on the impacted communities that you see on the right. Now, this report is a 450-page report. It has 250 different initiatives. I'm not going to walk you through all of them, but what I did want to show you was how we're looking at one chapter in this report, and it will give you a sense as to how we're thinking about this more globally. And what I'll do is I'll start with coastal defenses. And the way that we began our analysis of coastal defenses was by looking around the city at what worked during Hurricane Sandy, and looking around the world and asking what has worked in other communities. And what we found is that there are a series of interventions that cities and communities can make that actually have a significant impact on the survivability of neighborhoods. They include nourished beaches and dunes, increased elevations and berms, newer and elevated drainage systems, wave attenuation systems, and tidal barriers. And just for illustration, what you can see here is part of the beach in the Rockaways before the arrival of Hurricane Sandy. The area in back is a nourished dune, so it's a dune that has grasses on top that hold the sand in place. This is before the storm. This is after the storm. The beach has receded significantly, the dunes have receded significantly, but if you look closely, you can see the neighborhood behind was largely protected. And the one thing I will add is that whereas each of these has the ability to be a significant form of protection, the best protection are integrated systems that take into account as many of these as possible. So the next question that we asked ourselves was, since we know which strategies work, where do we start making investments? In an ideal world, obviously, we would make investments all across the city, but we know we live in a resource-limited world. And so the question is, where do we prioritize? And so what we did was we looked around the 5 boroughs and we asked, where is there the highest storm surge probability? Where is the most floodable floor area? Where is the most critical infrastructure? And where is the most vulnerable populations? And we developed the heat map that you see here that shows the areas where we need to be prioritizing our investments. And based on that, we've developed a $3.7 billion first phase set of investments, and they can be bucketed roughly into 3 categories. One is investments that will increase coastal edge elevations, keep water out of communities. And you can see that those are a combination of beach nourishment, armored stone defenses along the waterfront, bulkheads, and in certain places, tide gates. The second bucket involves trying to knock down waves before they hit vulnerable neighborhoods. There, we're looking at things like dunes, offshore breakwaters, wetland restoration and living shorelines, as well as groins, which is another word for jetties. And finally, we're looking at trying to block still water inundation, those large volumes of water that come without waves into protected communities. And there, the strategies range from integrated flood protection systems, which involve in-place hardened infrastructure like elevated roadways or planters, as well as systems that you can put in place when you know a storm is coming and remove them when the storm conditions don't exist. And you see an illustration of one of these systems being put into place in Europe. In addition to that, we also are looking at flood walls in certain places and storm surge barriers. When we have the resources, our goal then is to build on top of that $3.7 billion plan and to protect the entire city, as you see here. And I think this is a very important part of this plan. It's scalable to the resources that we have. The more resources we have, the more we can do. The fewer resources we have, it doesn't stop us from moving forward and making sure that we're protecting those most vulnerable neighborhoods. And as you can see in our report, we go through a number of other critical systems, just like the shoreline, and they're listed here, and again, I'm not going to go into detail. In addition to that, we also look at the communities that were most impacted by Hurricane Sandy, and you can see them listed on the screen. And what we try to do is we first look at all of the citywide solutions that we put in place, and we figure out how many of the problems in these neighborhoods are solved by those citywide solutions. And then we look at the gaps that are based on the very specific needs of these communities, and we fill them in with community-specific initiatives. And as you can see here, for each community, we have a long list of initiatives that are set forth on this map. This is for the Brooklyn-Queens waterfront. This is for the east and south shores of Staten Island. This is for South Queens. This is for southern Brooklyn. And this is for southern Manhattan. And again, I'm not going to go into extensive detail, but I will say that the range of these initiatives is quite wide. For example, at Newtown Creek, at the entrance to the Brooklyn and Queens, the border between Brooklyn and Queens, we're talking about a surge barrier that would keep waters from inundating inland areas. On the east and south shores of Staten Island, we're talking about an armored dune system that could be 15 to 20 feet high that would keep floodwaters from inundating some of the most impacted neighborhoods in the city. In the Rockaways, we're talking about economic development. On Coney Island Creek, we're talking about tide gates and wetlands. And finally, in southern Manhattan, we're talking about potentially creating an east side equivalent to Battery Park City, which not only provides economic development benefits, but also has the advantage of being able to block floodwaters if it's built at the right elevation. So the final question I would imagine that people are asking is, sounds great, how much is it going to cost and can you implement it? And I'm glad you asked because I have an answer right here. The answer is, first of all, that we think structure is very important. We need to put in place a director of resiliency, which the mayor, in fact, did last week, naming someone named Dan Zarilli to this post, the first ever director of resiliency for the city. And we want to enshrine this structure in city legislation, which is something that we're going to move forward with immediately. In terms of cost, this is a $19.5 billion plan. It sounds very ambitious, and it is. The good news is that $10 billion of that is already secured. We feel relatively confident that we will be able to secure another $5 billion. And in our report, we have a number of different strategies for filling the remaining gap, including up to $1 billion in additional city capital. And we plan on going to Washington and asking for the same treatment for the New York area that the Gulf Coast got after Katrina, which is that after the initial supplemental appropriation, Congress came back and appropriated another $9 billion for coastal defenses in and around New Orleans. We expect the same treatment here in New York. And finally, on the implementation side, we have a list of nearly 60 concrete steps that we can take by year-end 2013. They range from launching studies to actually beginning design work, and in some cases, construction on important capital projects, securing additional funding, and as importantly, amending regulations and laws that we think are really critical to protecting the area. So what I would say in conclusion is that the lesson that we take from this study is that New York, like many coastal communities, is significantly vulnerable to climate change. But the good news is that we here in New York have been tested before. In fact, just in the last 10 years, we've been tested in significant ways, whether it's the September 11th attacks, and we all know how Lower Manhattan has come back from that stronger and better than it was before. After the collapse of Lehman Brothers, a challenge of a very different type than Hurricane Sandy, but nonetheless a significant challenge to our city. We've emerged with record New York City employment, with the emergence of new sectors, and we believe that the same will be true of climate change, that we can rebuild what was lost, that we can make what is vulnerable less so, and that we can make New York a model not just for the rest of the country, but for the rest of the world, and that's what we aim to do with our plan. So thank you very much.
So I have a couple of questions, and I suspect that you'll be asking the same questions, and then we'll move on with our program. You continued in your full-time role at the Economic Development. Okay, A. B, how many weeks or months has it been since Sandy?
Sandy hit at the end of October, so it's been a little over 6 months, about 7 months.
And when did the mayor call you and say he wanted you to do this?
He asked the team to come together in about mid-December, and we will really hit the ground at the beginning of January.
So 5 months plus.
Around that.
Yeah, 5 months. Okay, that's an amazing amount of work. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And we're all impressed. And I don't know about the rest of you, but I suspect I'll be downloading the book and reading it. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.